Our today's speaker. So it is Stavros Tsitouras. He works as a senior project manager at Biosense Institute. Stavros has experience in business and research consulting, technology, scientific research and development and innovation, business development and marketing. He has been involved in the design and implementation of numerous EU and nationally funded projects, while having substantial experience working with tech startups. So without further ado, Stavros, you can slowly start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilia, for the introduction. Good morning and welcome everybody. As Emilia already said, our topic today is creating and managing startups. So I will start by giving you an idea about the agenda for today. Before I begin, I would like to say that this is a huge issue. So for each, let's put it this way, for each item in the agenda, we will probably need a workshop by itself. So in the next 1.5 hours, the presentation is expected to last around 1 hour. I will try to cover as much as possible all these aspects. So I will start with an introduction concerning the startup journey, so what to expect. The second item in the agenda is why startups fail. And then we're going to see the three distinct phases of a startup: the discovery phase, the validation phase, and the efficiency phase. Then we're going to, and the growth phase. And then we're going to have a look at the exit and exit strategies. And in the end, I'm going to close with some final remarks. But before we begin, I would like to make this presentation interactive because it's quite long. So I want people to participate. I think it will be better for everybody. So please, you can see now the instructions here. Grab your mobile phone and go to mendy.com. and use the code that you see here, 78303012. We're going to have 2 questions and 5 quiz questions. So in the end of the presentation, we're also going to have a winner. No present to give, but you're going to have the ethical satisfaction, let's put it this way. And I hope now you're starting grabbing your mobile phones. Please leave your mobile phones there in the web page that you have, because the questions are gonna be there. And so let's start with a question. So we will start with question number 1, and I want to find out what is the relationship of the audience with startups. So hopefully you're now in the Mentimeter. Great, and I see already some answers. You can answer more than one. Okay, great. So, okay, we're still having answers. I will wait a bit. Great. Okay, so I guess that it's all. Let's have a look. So nobody has founded the startup. 44% want to found the startup. That's very good. We have people that also work on a startup, and people that have no relationship. So we have actually a diverse audience. I think this is very good. Just to say a few words about myself, I'm in the category I founded startups, and I also want to found the new ones. So I have some experience myself. Okay, great. So let's continue. The first part, we're going to talk about the startup journey. So what to expect, actually, if you are involved in a startup or you want to be involved in a startup. And let's start with some reasons that people have in order to launch a startup. These are some, let's say, normal reasons that a lot of people have when they're thinking about starting a new business. So, I wanted to do something of my own. A lot of people say, I want to do something by myself. A valid reason. I wanted to change the world even before I had an idea. This can be a valid reason as well, but not too recommended. I had the product or service innovation in mind, or I had the technical innovation in mind. A lot of times we think of an idea and we think it's good in order to start a business. Another reason is that I wanted to escape from my payroll job. So for my normal job, I'm sick of it. I want to do something else, a valid reason. And another reason is that I have no other option. So this is called entrepreneur out of necessity. So there's nothing else actually to do. So my only option is actually to start my own business. All of these reasons can be more or less valid reasons for starting a new business, a startup. However, I would say that the most important reason that somebody should consider starting a startup is that he or she saw a problem and wanted to solve it. So we saw a problem and we have a solution for the problem. And as Eric Rice said, which is the writer of the Lean Startup, we will talk about that a bit later. What if we found ourselves building something that nobody wanted? So in that case, it didn't matter actually if we did it on time or on budget. So we need actually to build something that people actually want. This is the main and number one reason for building a startup. Let's have a look at some reasons or maybe myths that are out there that actually stop you for launching a startup. So some people consider that they're too young or inexperienced. The question here would be how can we define who is too young and who is not too young. Let's have a look at some facts. So the median age for startup owners worldwide is about 27 years old. I wouldn't say that, it's too old. Luminar Technologies founder Austin Russell, who is now 26 years old, his net worth now is 1.7 billion. So he is a 26-year-old billionaire. So I don't think that there is a better time actually to take risks when you are young. So that reason is not actually valid. Some people think I'm not smart enough to do it. Well, if you're smart enough actually to worry about that you're not smart enough, you probably are smart. So if you think about it, this is a good first step. I don't know nothing about business. This is actually a valid reason, but nevertheless, initially we focus on the product, on the solution, because we want to build something that somebody wants and not the money. Of course, we also focus on money as well. But in the beginning, this is our focus. So the thing is that most of the startups that will actually make something popular, something that people want, in the end will actually manage to get money out of it. And another reason would be that there's no more room for startups, because we're seeing that the place is full of startups, especially the last 10, 15 years, but especially the last 10 years, the startup scene is blooming. But again, this is not true, because by satisfying current needs would also lead to more needs. So the more the needs, the more the startups. So I don't think this is too much of a valid thing not to actually start a business. However, there are valid reasons that will stop you to launching a new business. And the number one reason is not to be determined enough. So it's not worth it to become a startup entrepreneur, to start a startup, unless you're willing to dedicate a lot of time and to take risks. Determination, time, and risk are, in my opinion, the top factors that actually would stop you for launching a startup if you're not ready to do these things. Now, let's give a definition. What is a startup? Because we talk about startups. So what is the difference between a startup, for example, and a company? Why is a startup different? A startup is actually different from any other type of company, and we will see actually that in a little bit more things later. So some definitions. A startup is a human institution designed to deliver a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. I have bolded here the words that I think are important. New product, uncertainty. Or a young company that is still searching for their business model, aiming at high growth. And usually startups create a new type of service or product aimed at solving a problem, as I earlier said. Or a group of experiments. It's a very important word, the word experiment. To find the solution to a problem and create sustainable and scalable business model around it. During the presentation, you will hear a lot of, let's say, startup jargon, words like scalable business model and other words. All of these words are very good to know, actually, because when you talk with the investor or when you interact with the startup scene, everybody's using this kind of jargon, so it's a very good idea to be familiar with it. Anyways, so Therefore, a startup, it's not like a regular company, as I said. What is the differences between startups and other companies? So, one main difference is that the startup is seeking disruption. Probably you would hear the term disrupting technologies. This is the thing that everybody is asking for startups, do something disruptive. To do something then radically better and more cost effective to such a degree that the old ways of working have not changed for survival. To change actually, this disruptive technology changes the market completely. It changes the way the market works. This is the ideal scenario for an idea. Another thing that is different with between startups and other types of businesses is speed. In the case of startups, speed actually matters to win the race. The startups need to react fast versus the large and flexible organizations. And here I will give some examples where actually startups or startup technologies destroyed giants in the market. So, for example, the digital cameras destroyed Kodak. The smartphones removed Nokia from its leading position. Or, for example, Spotify destroyed the CD business, or Netflix did the same for the movie rental business. So this is the kind of disruptive technology that actually changes the market. So overall, it's all about disruption and speed. And the thing is that being first in a business and to solve a problem actually comes with a very, very big benefit and, of course, a huge potential. And it is the fact that you are actually the first in the market and you are very well positioned. And this is the opportunity for you to become a market leader, or, of course, even better, a monopolist, which would be actually the dream of every startup. Let's continue with the differences between startups and other companies. So, we're talking about business models. A startup is a temporary organization designed to look for a business model that is repeatable and scalable. While on the other hand, a company is a permanent organization designed to execute the business model. So here we see the word business model. We don't see anything about technology or innovation. So a startup, it's not necessary that the startup will entail actually tech innovation or innovation. It is the case in many times, but it's not always the case. So because the startup is centered on new business models. And a good example is McDonald's, which was a startup in the 50s. There was no technology there, no real innovation. So what did McDonald's did and considered to be a startup in the 50s? They would actually reinvent its franchise. Franchise as a concept was, let's say, appeared in the late 19th century. So that the way that the franchise working back in the days was actually something like an exclusive license to sell products. So somebody would take somebody else's products and just get exclusive license to sell them. This doesn't mean that they branded their soap as the product that they were serving, that they were selling. So this is what actually McDonald's did differently. They were not just selling the right to use the company's name and learn the methods, but McDonald's actually was imposing an obligation to do things in a certain way. You know what I'm talking about. Definitely all the organizational structure, the way the food is prepared and so on and so forth, the marketing, everything is the same. So this is what actually McDonald's did differently back then and actually disrupted the fast food market. So now that we have an idea about what is a startup, what is the difference between startups, I would like you to go again on Mentimeter and give some answers about what do you think about startups. So the question here would be, what do you think when you hear the word startup? So you can write a couple of words in Mentimeter and let's have a look. Yeah, I hope it works. Okay. I don't see anything coming up. Is it a technical problem or? Okay, great. We have it. So, courage, great. Innovation. So, I think innovation is bolder because more people actually wrote this word: technology, opportunity, vision, business, investors, brave. Yes, actually, you need to be brave in order to start a startup. Great, great. Crowdfunding, we will see that later on. Okay, great, great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. All the words actually are very relevant. Okay, and risk. So let's go to part 2. Let's start actually from the end and not from the beginning. So let's talk about failure. Why startups fail? Let's begin with saying that the failure is actually okay. Why? Because one of the fundamentals of startup thinking is actually to expect to fail. And we will see why later on. But the initial approach is that, as we said, startup take risks. Therefore, if we take big risks, there will also be misses. But the thing is that the most important thing from failure is actually to learn from the failure, and to see the failure as an opportunity to learn. The environment that startups have, and if somebody of you have already worked in startups, you will know what I'm talking about, is that are machines for learning very quickly. And because I said earlier, speed is one of the main aspects that the startup should have. So this is the #1 thing. And the learning experience that you're going to have by working in a startup, it's actually very difficult to achieve in any other setting. So failure is okay in case we manage to actually get the lessons out of the failure and use them in the future for our benefit, to put it this way. So now let's have a look at some numbers. Let's see how many businesses fail, generally speaking, not startups. Let's see all businesses. So in the end of the first year, we can see that 20% of the businesses fail, 30% of the second year, 50% in the 5th year, and 70% by the end of the 10th year. So we can see that when we're talking about businesses overall, 70% of the business would fail after the 10th year. It's a very, very big number. Now, let's have a look how many startups fail. You can see here that 9 out of 10 startups fail, 90% failure percentage. So as I said earlier, this is the reason that why actually you need to be prepared for failure. Let's have a look now at the failure rate of scale-ups. When we're talking about scale-ups, we're talking about startups that are in a growth phase. We will see that later on in the presentation, and have achieved the product market fit. We will also have a look at that jargon later on. What is a product market fit? So to put it simply, these are startups that have actually succeeded in all the other phases. So their failure rate should or is expected to be lower than the failure of the early startups. Let's have a look at the numbers. So 75% of venture-backed companies, so companies that actually took money from venture capital, never return the cash to investors. Okay, and 30 to 40% of the cases, the investors lose their whole initial investment. So again, not only startups fail, but together with startups, the investors fail as well. So the question will be here, if most fail, who wins in the end? So why, for example, the investors are interested in startups, and how the startup ecosystem is actually sustainable in terms also of external funding resources. Let's have a look at that picture here. So we see, as we said, that we have 90% failure rate. And we can see here that, for example, if a venture capital funds 100 companies, they expect actually, because they know that 90 would fail, and they would get the money back of the 10. And not only of the 10, the best case scenario for investors is to get the money out of one startup that is called unicorn. Again, this is a startup jargon, and it's a unicorn is a company that has a valuation over 1 billion euro. So this is actually how the system works. In a few words, the investors invest in 100 companies and they expect to get the money back from 10 or 1 of them. So now that we've seen the numbers, the statistic of the number of startups that fail, let's have a look at the reasons why do startups fail. I think we should know that beforehand, before we're starting developing a startup, it's a good idea to see why we can fail. For many reasons, there are actually many reasons, countless reasons that somebody can, a startup can fail. And of course, it depends on who you ask. For example, if you ask an investor, he will maybe say that the startup founders were inadequate, were not good enough. So they have a lack of grit, they didn't know the industry, they didn't have leadership abilities. On the other hand, for example, if you ask founders, maybe they would say that there was a disharmony between the startup team and the investors. So again, it depends. And now let's go to the first quiz question, the #1 quiz question, and it has to do with why startups fail. So I will start. Okay, now I see the players here. Great, everybody has one avatar. So in the end, we're gonna know the winner. So let's start. If you answer faster, you get more points. So which is the top reason for startups failure? You can have one answer. Okay, great. So we have lack of product market fit. Excellent. 4 people got it right. So let's have a look actually at if this is right or wrong. And yes, it is. No market need. 42%. This is the #1 reason that startups fail. And we will actually see that in much detail later on in the presentation. Why? This is a very important reason. The second reason is to run out of cash. Normal. The third reason, not the right team. The team is very important. Fourth reason, get out competed, pricing cost issues, user unfriendly product without a business model, poor marketing, they ignored customers, and so on and so forth. You can see here so many different reasons, and this is actually the top reasons. There are probably other reasons as well. So the question here would be how to avoid failing. Of course, this is not an easy question to answer because as we said earlier, 9 out of 10 will fail. So some very generic advice is to set goals, to know where you're going, to do your research. So you need to know everything about the market. Very, very important. Know the customers, what they want. The more you know, the better. Of course, you need to love and believe in what you're doing, because if you don't believe in what you're doing, so if you cannot sell the product to yourself, you cannot sell it to anybody else. Don't quit. This is very important because there's definitely going to be difficulties. And of course, be optimistic, but at the same time, be realistic. So, and remember, of course, this is something important to remember, that founders of previously successful business have a 30% chance success with the next venture. So you can understand that probably it's normal to fail on the first time, you will try another time, and so on and so forth. Now, let's move to the distinct phases of the startups. Let's start with the discovery first. But before I start talking about the discovery phase, just a few words about the lean startup. I mentioned a quote earlier. The lean startup is actually an interesting, popular, and also validated approach, because a lot of startups, and actually a lot of famous startups, use that. I will give an example. Dropbox, for example, something that comes to my mind. They use the lean startup method. So the lean startup methodology is actually a method for managing and building startups. And it's based on experimenting, testing, and iterating. We will see that later on. And we develop our products based on the findings from the tests we got and the feedback. Very, very important. We will see later. So the presenting approach here is based on lean startup principles. It doesn't follow exactly the lean startup methodology, but the principles that you're going to see now, more or less, are based on the lean startup. So let's start with the basics. So how do we get an idea? What is a good startup idea? Very, very difficult issue here. Usually there are 2 paths for getting an idea. The first path is to get the idea organically. So it's like noticing a problem that the market could solve, but hasn't solved yet. How we get an organic idea? We are at the forefront of a new market or new technology. So we know the market and the technology, and of course, we have the experience and expertise to understand the market and its needs. So by knowing the market, knowing the problems, be experienced in there, we see things here and there, and then we get an idea to solve a problem. This is having an idea organically. The other path is to have the idea intentionally. So let's sit together, everybody, and try to think of some good startup ideas. This happened to me many times. I don't know about you, but I had this intentional exercise, to put it this way. But usually this is not such a good idea, because usually this kind of path yields ideas that sound plausible enough to fool you into working on them based on your perception of the world. This is very important. We come together with friends, people, and we start talking about ideas and how this could be great. But this is our own perception of the world. We think it's going to be good, but probably it's not. And by doing that, we will probably end up with a CISP, as it's called. So solution in search of a problem. So we think of a solution without actually considering what's the problem. We start by the solution. This is very common. This is a very common mistake for many startups. So when to start? When we had an idea, hopefully an organic one that come organically. So when we need to start, should we wait for the idea to sound perfect? I don't think there is probably a perfect idea, and we will see that later on when it comes to the lean startup, how we actually start with the idea. What is the status of the idea when we start? And you will see that actually it's in a very, very initial stages. Or maybe we should actually come with the first idea that comes to mind. So we discuss, we have an idea, and we say, okay, let's go, let's do it. So does this actually will solve a problem, or we're going to have a CISP, as I said earlier? Well, the truth actually, I believe, lies somewhere in the middle. So we don't have to wait for the perfect idea, but we don't have to go for the first idea that comes to our mind. We need to think about it a bit. So when we have an idea for a startup, some questions that we can ask ourselves and see whether the idea is good or not is actually, who wants to buy this right now? Are there people who want to buy our product or service? And actually the idea would be, who wants this so much that they'll actually use even a crappy version 1 made by 2-person startup that they never heard of? So is the product or the service so useful to somebody that he would actually use it, even if it's not perfect, because it does the work? If the answer, we cannot answer these questions negatively, so probably the idea is not that good. And now, another thing that we need to discuss is about the competition. So how the competition actually affects our idea. So this gives me the opportunity to go to quiz number 2 that has to do with startups, ideas, and the competition. So let's go to question 2. I hope you're ready. So I'm going to now press enter, and we will start. Let's have a look. So the chances of success for a startup idea are better when there is no competition, there are some competitors, or there is a really high competition. Okay. So 3 got it right and 3 got it wrong. So let's have a look. Of course, before I continue, I have to say that there's not a right or wrong answer definitely here. I mean, it doesn't mean that if you go in a market that is in a strong competition, you're doomed to fail. Or if you go to a market that has no competition, again, you're doomed to fail. But let's have a look. So what do you need to do in order to evaluate your idea that you have earlier? Is actually the first thing is to study the competition. And when we have strong competition in the space, it's usually a bad sign, because it's very difficult to enter the competition. You have a lot of competitors and so forth. However, as I said earlier, it's not a no-go. So I would give you an example. When Dropbox were doing their pitch, so when Dropbox were a small company that nobody actually knew, and for me this was very interesting. When they were pitching, an investor asked them, so there are like so many other cloud services like yours. So, and the founder asked the investor, do you use any of them? And the answer was no. So this was the point that Dropbox made. Yes, there are many competitors, but you don't use anybody. So probably there is space for somebody that is better than anybody else. So yes, you can go, but more or less, it's not a good sign. No competition, no market. I like this quote very much and I use it, and it's actually true. So if there is no competition, this is something that you have to think of. So either there is no market, so there is no need for what you're doing, or there are some unknown factors that are actually blocking the development of the idea of the business. Is that an ethical thing? Is a regulatory, legal, whatever? But usually when you see that there is no competition at all, it's a red flag. Unless, of course, you have the greatest idea in the world, which of course can be the case. So when you study the competition in the first early stage of evaluating the idea, it's a good idea to use specific tools. Don't do it on an ad hoc basis. There are many tools like the competitor analysis matrix. There are paid tools. There are tools that you can track the social media of competitors. You can look it up. There are many tools, but I recommend to use tools. And of course, talk with others that know the market. If you have an idea and you have people that actually are experts in the market, you should be also have an idea of the market. But if you know other people, talk with them. It's a very good idea before you go any further. Some signs to look that your idea is probably a good one after you have seen the competition. You have a founder market fit. So as I said earlier, you're an expert in what you're doing. Very important. You are making something you personally want to have. This is also important. And you're dealing with something that only recently became possible. So for example, there is a new technology or a new product and you can build on top of that. So it's something new. So, or there is a new situation like unpredicted situation like COVID-19. I don't know if you remember, for example, in the beginning when COVID started, the first 1, 2, 3 months, I remember that there were hundreds of new ideas and people were coming up of ideas of tracking. And so hundreds of new, let's say, startups of business ideas related to COVID-19. And I think they're still going on. The next step, after you initially evaluate your idea with a competition and you talk with people, is to write a one-page business plan. And don't be afraid when you listen to the word business plan, because we're not referring to the traditional business plan. I was many years in the consulting industry, so I know how it is. We were doing like not even 200, maybe 300-500 pages business plans that went into detail about each aspect of the business. This might be useful for an established business that have a specific timeline for expansion and so on and so forth. This could be useful, but not for a startup. This kind of business plan is not good for a startup. And why? Because, as we said, based on the lean startup methodology, we are working with iterations and changes all the time. So our plan will constantly change. And this is not a bad thing. This is a good thing. This is how we need to work, actually. It's something dynamic. So, of course, it doesn't mean that we don't need the business plan at all. And you can see here that actually ventures that create business plans tend to grow 30% faster. So it is a good idea to have a business plan. Let's have a look at this one-page business plan. I would recommend the business model canvas. It's a very good tool. And again, it's based on the lean startup methodology, which here you can see the key partners, activity, resources. I will not get into detail on how to fill in the business model canvas, or you can also use the lean canvas, which is very, very similar with the business model canvas. There are some differences, but I would say that the lean canvas covers a little bit more things, in my opinion. And very, very briefly, let's have a look. So we have the problem, which is very important. What is the problem we're trying to solve? The solution that we're planning. we have key metrics, key performance indicators, the unique value proposition which we actually need to fill in the end. So this is our pitch, to put it this way, in like 5 words. What is what we're offering and distinguish us from the current solutions? The unfair advantage. So why can we be successful instead of some other company or person? What is our advantage? The channels to reach the customers, which are the customer segments, the cost structure, which are the costs, and the revenue streams. This is all the basics that you need to cover in this one-page business plan. And I recommend to use the canvas. So after we finished, let's say, our one-page business plan, we need to actually further evaluate our idea. Okay, we think it's a good idea. We've seen the competition. We believe that there is space for us, but still we haven't talked with the actual people that have the problem, which are the users and the customers. So the first thing that we need to do in order to proceed there is to define our minimum viable segment, another jargon of startups. So what is the minimum viable segment? Actually, these are the people that have the problem we are solving, and these are the people that actually are easier to reach for us. So what we should do, we should get in touch with users and talk with them. I know maybe it sounds a little bit strange, maybe it sounds difficult, but in my opinion, it's the only way to go. So our goal would be here to find the potential customers that have this problem, and let's talk with them. So try to gather feedback in a structured way. So prepare questionnaires. Don't do an ad hoc web. Don't just start talking with people and then discuss with your friends, oh, he told me this and that. Do things in a structured way. There are, if you do your research, you can find numerous questionnaires, how to do the things. Important, very important. Let the users talk. Don't try to convince the users about the usability of your product or your idea. The question here in this phase is not actually to sell. We don't need to sell our product. We need to see the problems of our product or service, to test and evaluate it. So don't try to sell them. Don't tell them, no, you're wrong. You didn't get it right. Our product is great. No, you need to listen to the problems. And overall, try to find more about the problem you're solving. By now, I'm sure that you have a very, very good idea, but still there is always room for improvement. There is always room for improvement. So this is the first phase. Now we move on to the next phase, which is called the validation phase, after we finish the previous one. So this phase is actually where we test our idea empirically. So far, it was more on a theoretical basis. Let's put it this way. Now we go to the empirical stage. In my opinion, this is the most important phase for a startup. And a lot of startups either skip this phase or fail to do it properly. And if you do that, then you have a very, very big risk on investing money, time, effort. And of course, this comes with emotions, and actually bad emotions, into something that is actually doomed to fail from the very start. So you start and you go fully, to develop your idea without doing the validation phase. Not a good idea. But of course, it's the hardest phase, because most entrepreneurs will have to face this one on their own, because they would most probably have little to no access to resources, human and financial resources. This is why it's hard. You need to spend actually your own time on that. So how can we do early validation? These are some ideas for early validation. Of course, these are not the only things that we can do. And of course, it depends on the kind of product or service we're dealing with. So this is an ad hoc situation, let's put it this way. But some ideas are the following. So content and social media validation experiments. We can use social media group, forums, so on and so forth. Well, people who actually have the problem are there. I'm sure that there is a forum or a group for every problem you can imagine. I'm sorry about that. So if you try hard enough, you will find it. I'm sorry. So after you find that, you create content. You create content that is actually relevant to the problem. So for example, you can give advice. because you're an expert. You can give advice how to solve it and connect it, of course, with your solution. Or alternatively, just for the sake of participation and to see what people are thinking, we can ask advice for solving it. So you have an idea to ask people, okay, so how do you solve that? And then you can say, I have the solution. So you share the content in the groups and see the reactions, about what you say, what you're talking about, and the comments. If your content gets actually attention, people are starting to be interested in what you're saying, it's a good indicator that the problem actually exists. And there are people that actually are interested to solve it. So that means that your help will hopefully be valuable for them. And this part will actually complement the interviews for the idea evaluation that we talked about in the previous stage. Another idea for early validation is running pre-sales, if possible, of course. And I said earlier, depending on the product or service, maybe sometimes it's not possible to do that. So you create a landing page for the validation experiments, and it's actually a direct test of your assumption. So the thing here is to find out whether people are willing to pay money for what you're offering. Because if they're not willing to pay money, then better stop. So you create a landing page before you create the actual product or service. So this is actually, you present your exact offering and you say, I have this solution that's going to do this, and that. So you just describe what you have. Of course, some people, would have some prototypes, some pictures, some mock-ups. For example, if it's an application, you have to have something, of course, there, but not the solution itself. This is the idea. And you can test this landing page in different places that we talked earlier. So you go back to your social media groups, to the people you know, to the people from the industry. You can also run, if you can, and if your finances allow you to do so, some well-targeting low-budget campaigns. For example, Google Ads, you can spend like 100, 200 euros there. Just put the traction there if you can. And of course, it's a good idea to sell your idea at least a couple of times in person, because it's a different thing to go online and it's a different thing to talk with people. So after we finish our validation experiment results, and whatever these are, we need actually to measure, to see what happened. So there are three options here. We have bad results. So we had no pre-sales. Our post didn't get any traction. Actually, people didn't pay any attention to what we were saying, more or less, and nothing worked, to put it this way. So here in this scenario, we have two options. The option number one is to actually discard the idea or heavily improve it. If we need to discard the idea or improve it, at least we save time and money, because we found that in a very early stage that our idea is problematic. So we didn't spend all this time and money to create a product and service and then go to the market and realize that, okay, nobody wants that. So it's not a bad thing, to stop, really. If you had the mixed results, so we had some good results, some bad results, we seem to be onto something, but not 100% sure. So in that case, try to repeat the experiment by actually fine-tuning the problematic aspects of our solution, what we think that didn't get good feedback, and then go to step one and try again the experiment. If we have good results, so then, okay, great job, we proceed and we move on to the next step. And the next step would be to prepare an MVP, minimum viable product. Again, another jargon from startups, but again, very important to know. So, what is an MVP? The MVP is actually it's there to validate our idea in a convincing manner. So, the MVP, it's actually the most minimalistic yet viable version of a product we are envisioning. To put it simply, something ridiculously simple. Okay. But if we see on the picture here on the right, we see on the top, this is not an MVP, and on the downside of the picture, this is an MVP. So what's the difference? On the top, we had the final product is a car in both cases, okay? But in the first case, the first MVP, which is a wheel, okay, it's not actually viable. So a wheel doesn't work, two wheels don't work. But if you see on the bottom, we have a bicycle, a skate, everything there is a valuable product. So the bicycle, the skateboard can take us from part A to part B. The same thing is with the car. It is a minimal valuable product. So this is the idea, to have something very simple, but something that actually does the job that we promised, even in the most simple way. And an example, I will give you an example for Airbnb. So what Airbnb did, they did this landing page experiment. So they had this first landing page as an MVP back in 2008. What was there in this landing page? No payments. So if somebody wanted to log in and use Airbnb, of course, back in the days, Airbnb was not actually in the shape that is today. They just use rooms in apartments and houses to have people there. They didn't rent the whole apartment or the house. But still, they didn't have a payment. So they had to exchange money with the house owner. That's kind of strange, if you think about it. And there was no map view. So you didn't know where the house was. So in the map. These are two factors that, if you think about it today, if you had a service that didn't have an exchange payment structure or no map, you would think, no, I don't want to use that. But still, people use Airbnb in this very, very initial form because actually it solved the problem that they have. Even if it didn't solve it 100% correctly, they said, okay, I'm going to pay the owner. Okay, it's fine because it solves my problem. It's not perfect, but it works. And it actually, you know that it worked in the end. So in order to, an aspect about MVPs, in order to prepare it, you need to find the resources to do so. Of course, again, it depends on the MVP. I mean, the MVP can be something very simple, but also in some cases cannot be that simple, depending on the market. So I'll give you an example. If you want to build a rocket, for example, there's no simple MVP here. But more or less, you would need resources. You will need financial resources. For example, if you need equipment, consumables, and of course, you will need human resources. So there's still, of course, financial because the people need some money. They need to be paid, unless you have somebody on your team. So the question here would be where to get the resources in that early stages of the idea. And by saying so, we can move on to quiz number 3, which has to do with early startup funding sources. And the question here would be, and I start the quiz now. Okay. So the question is, which is the top funding source for early stage startups? Okay. So friends, family and fools, banks, venture capital, personal savings, crowdfunding, and angel investment. So we got 3 people that got it right. The top funding source doesn't mean again that the others don't count, but the top funding source for an early startup is actually personal savings and credit. And of course, the second will be friends, family, and fools, I guess. So after that, after we launched them, we got the money from our own savings or from friends, family, and fools, and we managed to actually create the minimum valuable product. So the next phase after that is actually to launch the MVP, get feedback, evaluate the MVP, and iterate. So if you remember the picture with a car, we start with skate, then we go with the bicycles. All of these are MVPs, all of these. So we don't have one MVP. Okay. So we launch the MVP. So as I said, we use the channels we use for validation, the social media. We need to make sure that we have enough users in order to get credible feedback. So for example, the feedback for 2, 3, 4 users, depending again on the product, of course, but it's not enough. So we need to make sure that we have enough users. It's not easy, but we need to put effort on that. Then the second part is to get feedback. Talk to the users. All of the users, after we launch our MVP and get feedback. Very important is to put some KPIs, key performance indicators, in order to see what works or not. So to give you an example, let's give an example from agriculture. If we had a solution, for example, that could reduce fertilizer, we would use as a KPI that the solution reduced 30% the fertilizer, or the irrigation cost, 40% savings in irrigation cost. these kind of KPIs that actually provide value to the idea, to the business, but also provide the value to the user. So you can see what can I get out of it. And of course, as I said earlier, use structured and replicable tools, questionnaires, interviews, and so on and so forth. The next step after we get our initial feedback is iterate, and then again, iterate. So, as I said, MVP, minimum viable product, is a strategy and not a one-time thing. I remind you again the picture with the car. So we have multiple tests and MVPs to get actually the validated learning that we need in the end of this process and proceed to the next experiment. So after we finish and we launch our MVP and we got the feedback, what's next? What we need to do? We are now getting closer to product market fit, which is actually the ideal situation. And what we say when we meet product market fit, it's the state of a product when customers are satisfied with the product and recommend the product to friends, and of course recommend the business itself to friends. So it's when the customers are happy, initially at least. Or here, if we get to the product market fit, it's great. Okay, it means that our idea is actually, we're getting onto something and we probably have a good chance of success. If not, so if the MVP, the launch of the MVP is not successful, we don't get good feedback and so on and so forth, then we go to another part. It's called pivoting. Again, startup jargon. But the pivoting is not actually so complicated idea. It's actually just change your idea. That's what's called pivoting. So if you have a startup and you are in a situation, say we're going to pivot, it means that something didn't work and we change the idea completely or change it heavily, rapidly. And a final remark about this phase has to do is whether to incorporate or not. So we have an idea. Do we need to have a business? Actually, on paper, when do we need to incorporate? Well, more or less the idea here is to incorporate as late as possible, but not too late. But it doesn't make sense, for example, to incorporate if we are an idea that's still on the air and it could be forgotten in a couple of months. So not a good idea to start a company for many reasons. And you have expenses as well, right? So if you have an idea, you don't have a business. Okay, that's the point here. There are three signals that it may be time to incorporate. So, for example, you reach an agreement with your co-founder, if you have one. We will talk about that later on a bit. For yourself in the business, so start doing the business to avoid conflict as well. Your idea is starting to gain traction and earn money. Of course, if you want to get money, you need to have a business. Otherwise, you cannot get the money. And of course, someone is going to invest money in the business, which is the next important step we're going to talk about. So if somebody wants to invest, yes, we need to have a business. There are many types of companies, and sometimes the status of the company is country dependent, so it depends on the country. But more or less, the obligations, the taxation, more or less are the same, especially we're talking in the EU. I'm not going to go through details with what kind of company you can found and so on and so forth, because it depends again on the people, on the country, on the product, and many other factors. What I can say here is that you need to find a very good financial and legal advice in order to get advice what kind of company you need to do, where to do it, because now, you know, it doesn't matter where you are. We see a lot of people creating companies in other countries for taxation reasons or other reasons. So your accountant actually and your legal advisor, when you have a startup, should be your best and trusted friends. This is 100%. So pay attention on the people that are working on your financials and your legal things. So the next phase, after we finish that, of course, successfully, is the efficiency phase. But before we start talking about this phase, I wanted to say a few words about funding your startup, because now, by the time you are in the efficiency stage, you should definitely start considering approaching investors and see how you're going to get money, because the investment needs are going to be much higher now. You need money. After you have the successful MVP and the good product market fit, you're going to be now a business. So here, Of course, this funding your startup, to put it this way, again, it can be a specific, a workshop, only that. So I'm going to go very, very briefly in that issue. So we have here the seed or pre-seed startup funding, which is more from personal savings, as we said, equity capital, which is angel and venture capital, is not that much, I would say, loans, again, and then you have the early stage, and actually we are here now when we're talking, we are in the early stage, and the pre-seed we said earlier. So here you had equity capital. Equity capital means that we're going to see that earlier on. It means that you actually give shares of your company. That's what it is, to somebody to invest. Then again, you have loans, grants, and crowdfunding. And in the growth stage, again, of course, you're going with normally with venture capital. And in the exit, you're going to cash out. You're going to see that later on. Here again, some jargon of startups. We have the Series A to Series B, C funding. And of course, we had the seed and pre-seed, as I said earlier. So when we're talking about pre-seed funding, we are on the proof of concept of prototype or MVP stage, as we said earlier. You need that for hiring purposes, not so much, I would say. And the amount of investment would be 4K to 1 million. In Series A, you have the growth phase. You have the development of operations. Until 10 million will be the funding, more or less. Series B has to do about growth and hiring people. Again, you have market expansion in business. And in Series C, you have large-scale expansions and acquire new business and so on and so forth. So these are more or less the series that have to do with funding your startup. One other point here about financing your startup is that overall speaking, you need to make a decision based on your needs, the idea, and I would recommend to look for all possible funding schemes. Some have advantages, some have disadvantages. So for example, friends, family, and fools, as I said, usually at early stages, but please be careful with your friends and relatives and not get their money, and make them broke because of your idea. And I've seen that happening sometimes. Then you have public funding, national, regional, or EU level. The pros here are that you can find different schemes for different stages. So you can go pre-seed, early stage, even you can get money if you are like an established business, not a lot of money, the truth is, compared to venture capital, but still it's help. The disadvantage is that it's time consuming and slow. And when it comes to startups, I said that speed is number one. Speed is number one reason, so you have to be fast. And then you have the venture capital, the investors, which is actually the only way you can get money. But the disadvantage is that you have equity, so you give your shares. And you have loans. It's a straightforward process, but the disadvantage is that it's a loan. So overall, whatever you do, again, please, be prepared to prepare something that people want to buy, and independently of the funding, you will probably succeed. And I always repeat that because it's very important. Then the next step is to further validate, refine your business model. So you already, of course, have a business model here in the previous phase. You have the business model canvas, as we said, we have the competitor analysis, we have the market analysis, we have the validation with users. So we must have a very good idea about our business model here. We should, so the next step will be to narrow down on the most efficient customer acquisition strategy. This is what it means to refine our business model. We will explain what do we mean by acquisition strategy, how to get customers, actually. So, for example, in the early stages, you could sell directly to customers. This is a good thing, and you could learn a lot about the market. But in this stage that we're here, for example, we can find out that direct sales are actually very expensive because it's a very expensive customer acquisition channel. So a channel that we get customers, because each purchase needs to pay for the time of the salesperson. So again, in that case, you see that we might change our business model and strategy. We had a business model in the beginning that was direct sales, but then we find out that the customer acquisition costs, which is how much money we spend to get a new customer, are higher than we expected. And then in the end, and again, this again some startup jargon, we need to check the customer acquisition cost, as I said earlier, how much money we need to spend to get a new customer in relation to customer lifetime value. So what is customer lifetime value? How much an average customer will spend on products and services over the entire relationship with our business. So by the end of this phase, we need to have a very, very good idea about these numbers here. When we're talking about business models, I'm not going to stay here, just because again, the jargon we can see here, I just kept this table to give you an idea of how many business models are out there, and this is not the only ones that exist. So just to have an idea, business model like freemium, the revenue sharing business model, franchise, as we said earlier, peer-to-peer, and many, many, many more. So the next step will be scaling up. We need to repeat, as I said, the startup should be scalable. So repeat what works. We have a product that has a good market fit, and we have a sustainable business model. And now the next phase is the repetition, scale up. So the experiments are over. Now the time is to actually choose the best working channels that we have and focus there. This is not only important to make money, of course, which is very important, but it's also very important to check all these things that we mentioned earlier, the business model, the acquisition channels, and the product, if it works at scale. And then after we have all these iterations scaling up, we will test again. As we said earlier, maybe early adopters was easy to reach, but the general market has a higher customer acquisition cost. Overall, we need to make sure that the idea is scalable, because if it's not, there's no startup. The next phase is start building a team. Okay, this can happen a little bit earlier, this can happen a little bit later. It's not, let's say, standardized where you start building a team, depending on the situation. But more or less here you start building one. The first step is to select a co-founder, if you don't have already. This is not a compulsory thing. I mean, not all companies have a co-founder, but most of them do. If you can find one, it would be a good idea, because it makes your team more convincing to investors and everybody. It's not just one person. So you share the burden, the workload and the financial burden, and of course, fill gaps in the business. So a co-founder would actually be a good idea to complement your business, to fill in the gaps, the knowledge that you don't have. Other than that, build the team. We see that the inadequate team is the number 3 reason for startup failure. So it's very, very important, the team. There are there's many information on the internet how to build teams. I'm not going to stay to that long, but more or less you need to identify the voids of your startup, to identify the skills that you need, and pay attention to that. Very important, think about time, because we said again, speed. Startups has to do with speed. So you should think, for example, the training needed vs against the startup need for speed. Should I hire somebody that I need to train him for 6 months? Maybe not. We don't have that time. And pay attention to the organizational culture that you're going to create, because the first employees that you're going to get play a role in forming the organizational structure of every business. And finally, time management, very important. You need the team and maybe co-founder, since at that point you will really will not have enough time to do things, because by that phase you need to rethink about the idea, fine-tune the business model, to fine-tune the product, to try to get users, to try to generate sales, talk with investors, think about marketing. And these are just a few things that I can think of right now. There are hundreds of things that the startup owner needs to do, and trust me, it's not easy. And that takes us to the 4th question of the quiz, and has to do with time. So the question would be, okay, I hope you're ready, and I will start the question now. Okay. And the question would be, what percentage of their time do startup owners spend on tasks that do not generate income? So other tasks, hiring, HR, payroll, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, or more than 50. Okay. 40% is the correct answer. One got it right. But you can understand 40% of the time, startup owners do not actually deal with their business in terms of generating income. So you can understand how hard it is. And let's go to the growth phase, because I feel we have 20 minutes left. I'm not going to stay in this phase too much, because by the time, if you reach the growth phase, actually it means that you've done things right. And this is the phase where your scale up turns into real big business. So I guess that if you actually manage to go to that phase, I don't think that you would wait for my advice here. You would know things very, very well. You are in a position now that you are established business and you are going to get really big. So what's next in this growing phase? You go to fundraising Series A, as we explained earlier, we start to rate. You got the seed and pre-seed investment, and now you're going to Series A to Z investment to dominate the market. And actually, this is the time to approach investors. And if you're lucky enough, the investors probably have approached you already. So what kind of growth are we talking about in the growth phase? When you get to Series A and to Z funding, you actually allows you to invest in extremely aggressive growth. So we're talking about non-organic growth. Organic, when we're talking about organic growth, it means the growth of our own business. So growth in sales, growth in the team of our business, and so on and so forth. This is organic growth. And this is actually happening as well. But by now we're talking about non-organic growth, which means growing by merging with or acquiring other companies, aggressive growth. Or another thing is targeting additional market segments. This is something to do on the growth strategy. For example, when Facebook started, it started with college students, and the growth phase was available to everybody that had a computer. That's it. The next step is to be the full stack startup, vertical expansion. So to expand in the whole supply chain and to provide users with an end-to-end service, if possible, of course. And of course, the final step, which is a dream of every startup, is to become a platform. When we say becoming a platform, it's not become a monopoly, but you are the market leader. So actually you control the whole ecosystem, which is the end game for every startup. You regulate the market, and you're not competing in the market. And finally, the exit. What is exit? Let's talk about what we mean when we say exit. An exit is when a founder leaves a startup in a positive way. And I say leave the startup because he gets money to leave the startup, and so he sells it. He's not kicked out of the startup. This is a positive exit. There is also, we also use exit strategy for businesses. And this is the negative part of exiting. So businesses, when they need to leave the market, so everything is failing, so you need to have an exit strategy to know where to stop. And now we're going to focus, of course, on the positive side, which is an exit strategy of a founder. And you need to have an exit strategy. You need to consider that, of course, not in the first time you get the idea, you need to have an exit strategy. This is too optimistic. But after a while, when you see that things are going well, you need to consider an exit strategy, because you can choose when to leave, to create a transition in your business when you're leaving. And of course, most importantly, to maximize the selling price of your business. This has to do, of course, with startup valuation. So how much you valuate your business, which is another part for another workshop. It's very important. But the selling price you're going to get from your business has to do with the valuation, actually. Some common exit strategies is the acquisition. So you sell your company to another company. This is what it is, actually, usually a bigger one. So it's common here in this situation to stay on the company for a period of time, maybe 6 months, 2 years, to help with the transition. Then the second one is merger. So one company joins another and they merge. Of course, usually this is called merger and acquisition because the one company that merges another usually again is bigger than the other. So it's more or less merger and acquisition. And then you have initial public offering, which it's actually when a company goes public on the stock market. And this is a very good opportunity, again, for startups to make a lot of money here. Normally, in this case, the founder and the management team will stay in place, and nothing will change. Of course, nothing will change in terms of organizational structure because you're going to have certain regulatory requirements if you go public. And that takes us to the final quiz question, and we're going to actually have the winner of the quiz. And I hope you're ready for that. So let's go. It has to do with the average exit time for founders. So, okay, this is the final question, and I start it now. And the question is, what is the average time required to exit? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, or more than 7 years? Okay. Well, 6 years. So everybody's got it wrong, but you can understand. You need to spend on average 6 years of your life to exit. So you need to consider very well where you're getting into. But now let's see who is the big winner. And let's see, the winner is, well, great, the dog. Congratulations to the dog. We don't have a present to give you, but you can contact me after the presentation to see if we can do something about it. Thank you very much all for your participation in the quiz. And now let's move on with the final remark and to close the presentation. So, some final remarks from my side. The startup scene is blooming, as I said earlier, and I think that it will continue to do so because there are always problems to be solved. More or less, as we see here, the approach on the startup journey is more or less, let's say, standardized. What do I mean is like, we need to follow the basics. So when you have an idea, please try to follow all these, not rules, all these approaches that we talk with the users, do all the things that you need to do. And if you do these things that are standardized, really investors will gonna appreciate that. Speak the jargon of startups, find what's happening in the ecosystem. But the most important thing is to be ready to take risks, be ready to fail, of course, but most importantly, to be determined to succeed. So that was it. Thank you very much for your time, and good luck to everybody. I will now stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Okay, Stavros, I think it's okay to ask if anyone has any question.
Yes, of course. Of course.
You can put it in the chat or you can unmute yourself, either way.
Yes.
Okay, we have one question in the chat. So in your experience, what is the biggest mistake that startups usually make?
Yes, that's a good question, a difficult question. There is no simple answer to this. As I said, I have worked with many startups, and I would say that, in my opinion, first, the number one mistake that startups do, and I did the same mistake myself, actually, to be honest, is not product market fit. I said that earlier. We have an idea and we think that it works, but there's no problem. And the number two mistake, I would say, is not talking with users or skipping the validation phase. I mentioned earlier. Okay, I understand that sometimes it's difficult to find users and sometimes it's not. So, for example, we were working in a solution that had to do with Alzheimer patients. So the users were Alzheimer patients. Can you talk with these users? No. But then you need to find another way. So, for example, you need to talk with the doctors. You need to talk with the relatives. So these are the two, I think, main mistakes that startups do here. And the third one, I would say, is not to devote too much time. So you have another job here, you say, okay, I'm going to do that as well on the side. I don't think it's easy to work that way. You need to be devoted in what you're doing. I hope I answered your question.
Okay, we have another one. And thank you, Stavros, for the first answer. And it's really great when you give examples too. So the other question is, are there any differences in the approach we should have towards our startup based on the industry that we are active?
Okay, good one. So yes, true. In the presentation, our talk was quite generic. We did not focus on a specific industry. However, yes, there are differences between industries. To give you an example, failure rates for startups and businesses are different in each industry. You can look it up, for example. We have different rates in technology, different rates in pharmaceuticals, and so on and so forth. So yes, or sometimes users are harder to or easier to approach, as I gave the example earlier. Or, for example, building a minimum viable product is somewhere easier or more difficult. For example, if you have an industry with a significant regulation, so we're talking about the pharmaceutical industry. There, I mean, it's very, very difficult to build an MVP. I mean, you have regulation, it's very hard to launch it as well. So yes, more or less, you have to have different strategies overall, depending on the industry. However, as I said in my closing remark, the approach should be always more or less the same. Design the idea, test the idea. So independently of the industry, you need to follow a specific methodology, find the product market fit, as I said earlier, have knowledge of the market by the founders, which play a critical role, and yeah, that's about it.
Okay, thank you. We have one comment. Thanks in advance for sharing the presentation. Yes, of course, we will share a presentation. Also, in addition to that, I have here, I will send it in the chat, a questionnaire. Please fill it in. It's not to, it's just to see your comments regarding this session, but just to improve ourselves in the future, nothing regarding, because this is not the last one. I think we will have one more, at least one more in June. So we will keep you informed about that. Are there any more comments or questions? I don't see any.
I guess everything was clear then.
Yes. Great presentation. Thank you. Yes, I fully agree here. It was really great.
Thanks. I hope the people here enjoyed it, and I hope the interactive thing was also helpful.
Yes, congratulations to the winner. It wasn't me.
Yeah.
But okay. Okay. If there's no additional questions, I will send this questionnaire in the email as well as the presentation. I think that is it. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the presentation, and we will keep you informed regarding the further sessions. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. Thanks.
Have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.